fantasy, sci-fi, thriller fiction. Like magic, an invisible chain of sound once more circles the planet.
Varney, the vampire, or the feast of blood.
Written by Thomas Peckett Prest and James Malcolm Rymer. Chapter 22. The consultation. The determination to leave the hall. This was certainly the most seriously reasonable meeting which had been held at Bannerworth Hall on the subject of the much-dreaded vampire. The absolute necessity for doing something of a decisive character was abundantly apparent, and when Henry promised Flora that her earnest wish to leave the house should not be forgotten as an element in the discussion which was about to ensue, it was with a rapidly growing feeling on his own part to the effect that that house, associated even as it was with many endearing recollections, was no home for him. Hence he was more inclined to propose a departure from the hall if it could possibly be arranged satisfactorily in a pecuniary point of view. The pecuniary point of view, however, in which Henry was compelled to look at the subject was an important and a troublesome one. We have already hinted at the very peculiar state of the finances of the family, and, in fact, although the income derivable from various sources ought to have been amply sufficient to provide Henry and those who were dependent upon him with a respectable livelihood, yet it was nearly all swallowed up by the payment of regular installments upon family debts incurred by his father. The question, therefore, or, at all events, one of the questions now was, how far would a departure from the hall of him, Henry, and the other branches of the family act upon that arrangement? During a very few minutes' consideration, Henry, with the frank and candid disposition which was so strong a characteristic of his character, made up his mind to explain all this fully to Charles Holland and his uncle. When once he formed such a determination, he was not likely to be slow in carrying it into effect, and no sooner, then, were the whole of them seated in the small oaken parlor than he made an explicit statement of his circumstances. "But," said Mr. Marchdale when he was done, "I cannot see what right your creditors have to complain of where you live, so long as you perform your contract to them. True, but they always expected me, I knew, to remain at the hall, and if they chose, why, of course, at any time they could sell off the whole property for what it would fetch, and pay themselves as far as the proceeds would go. At all events, I am quite certain there could be nothing at all left to me." "I cannot imagine," added Mr. Marchdale, "that any men could be so unreasonable." "It is scarcely to be borne," remarked Charles Holland, with more impatience than he usually displayed, "that a whole family are to be put to the necessity of leaving their home for no other reason than being pestered by such a neighbor as Sir Francis Varney. It makes one impatient and angry to reflect upon such a state of things." "And yet they are lamentably true," said Henry. "What can we do? Surely there must be some sort of remedy." "There is but one I can imagine, and that is one we all alike revolt from. We might kill him." "That is out of the question. Of course, my impression is that he bears the same name really as myself, and that he is my ancestor, from whom was painted the portrait on the panel." "Have circumstances really so far pressed upon you," said Charles Holland, "as at length to convince you that this man is really the horrible creature we surmise he may be? Dare we no longer doubt it?" cried Henry in a tone of excitement. "He is the vampire." "I'll be hanged if I believe it," said Admiral Bell. "Stuff and nonsense. Vampire, indeed. Bother the vampire." "Sir," said Henry, "you have not had brought before you, painfully as we have, all the circumstances upon which we, in a manner, feel compelled to found this horrible belief. At first, incredulity was a natural thing. We had no idea that ever we could be brought to believe in such a thing." "That is the case," said Marchdale, "but step by step We have been driven from utter disbelief in this phenomenon to a trembling conviction that it must be true. Unless we admit that, simultaneously, the senses of a number of persons have been deceived. That is scarcely possible. Then do you really mean to say there are such fish? Said the Admiral. We think so. Well, I'm damned. I've heard all sorts of yarns about what fellas have seen in one ocean and another, but this does beat them all to nothing. It is monstrous, exclaimed Charles. There was a pause for some moments' duration, and then Mr. Marchdale said, in a low voice, Perhaps I ought not to propose any course of action until you, Henry, have yourself done so, but even at the risk of being presumptuous, I will say that I am firmly of opinion you ought to leave the hall. I am inclined to think so, too, said Henry. But the creditors, interposed Charles. I think they might be consulted on the matter beforehand, added Marchdale, when no doubt they would acquiesce in an arrangement which could do them no harm. Certainly no harm, said Henry, for I cannot take the estate with me, as they well know. Precisely. If you do not like to sell it, you can let it. To whom? Why, under the existing circumstances, it is not likely you would get any tenant for it than the one who has offered himself. Sir Francis Varney? Yes. It seems to be a great object with him to live here, and it appears to me that notwithstanding all that has occurred, it is most decidedly the best policy to let him. Nobody could really deny the reasonableness of this advice, although it seemed strange and was repugnant to the feelings of them all as they heard it. There was a pause for some seconds' duration, and then Henry said, It does indeed seem singular to surrender one's house to such a being. Especially, said Charles, after what has occurred. True. Well, said Mr. Marchdale, if any better plan of proceeding, taking the whole case into consideration, can be devised, I shall be most happy. Will you consent to putting off all proceedings for 3 days? Said Charles Holland suddenly. Have you any plan? My dear sir, said Mr. Marchdale, I have, but it is one which I would rather say nothing about for the present. I have no objection, said Henry. I do not know that 3 days can make any difference in the state of affairs. Let it be so, if you wish, Charles. Then I am satisfied, said Charles. I cannot but feel that, situated as I am regarding Flora, it is almost more my affair than even yours, Henry. I cannot see that, said Henry. Why should you take upon yourself more of the responsibility of these affairs than I, Charles? You induce in my mind a suspicion that you have some desperate project in your imagination, which by such a proposition you would seek to reconcile me to. Charles was silent, and Henry then added, Now, Charles, I am quite convinced that what you have hinted at is the fact. You have conceived some scheme which you fancy would be much opposed by us? I will not deny that I have, said Charles. It is one, however, which you must allow me for the present to keep locked in my own breast. Why will you not trust us? For 2 reasons, indeed. The one is that I have not thoroughly determined upon the course I project, and the other is that it is one in which I am not justified in involving anyone else. Charles, said Henry, despondingly, only consider for a moment into what new misery you may plunge poor Flora, who is, heaven knows, already sufficiently afflicted by attempting an enterprise which even we, who are your friends, may unwittingly cross you in the performance of. This is one in which I fear no such result. It cannot so happen. Do not urge me. Can't you say at once what you think of doing? Said the old Admiral. What do you mean by turning your sails in all sorts of directions so oddly? You sneak. Why don't you be, what do you call it, explicit? I cannot, Uncle. What are you, tongue-tied? All here know well, said Charles, that if I do not unfold my mind fully, it is not that I fear to trust anyone present, but from some other, most special reason. Charles, I forbear to urge you further, said Henry, and only implore you to be careful. At this moment the room door opened, and George Bannerworth, accompanied by Mr. Chillingworth, came in. Do not let me intrude, said the surgeon. I fear, as I see you seated, gentlemen, that my presence must be a rudeness and a disturbance to some family consultation among yourselves. Not at all, Mr. Chillingworth, said Henry. Pray be seated. We are very glad indeed to see you. Admiral Bell, this is a friend on whom we can rely, Mr. Chillingworth. And one of the right sort, I can see, said the Admiral as he shook Mr. Chillingworth by the hand. Sir, you do me much honor, said the doctor. Not at all, not at all. I suppose you know about this infernal odd vampire business? I believe I do, sir. And what do you think of it? I think time will develop the circumstance sufficiently to convince us all that such things cannot be. Damn me, you are the most sensible fellow, then, that I have yet met with since I have been in this neighborhood, for everybody else is so convinced about the vampire that they are ready to swear by him. It would take much more to convince me. I was coming over here when I met Mr. George Bannerworth coming to my house. Yes, said George, and Mr. Chillingworth has something to tell us of a nature confirmatory of our own suspicions. It is strange, said Henry, but any piece of news, come it from what quarter it may, seems to be confirmatory, in some degree or another, of that dreadful belief in vampires. Why, said the doctor, when Mr. George says that my news is of such a character, I think he goes a little too far. What I have to tell you, I do not conceive has anything whatever to do with the fact or one fact of there being vampires. It is simply this, that I was sent for by Sir Francis Varney myself. You sent for? Yes, he sent for me by special messenger to come to him, and when I went, which under the circumstances you may well guess I did with all celerity possible, I found it was to consult with me about a flesh wound in his arm, which was showing some angry symptoms. Indeed, yes, it was so. When I was introduced to him, I found him lying on a couch and looking pale and unwell. In the most respectful manner, he asked me to be seated, and when I had taken a chair, he added, Mr. Chillingworth, I have sent for you in consequence of a slight accident which has happened to my arm. I was incautiously loading some firearms and discharged a pistol so close to me that the bullet inflicted a wound on my arm. If you will allow me, said I, to see the wound, I will give you my opinion. He then showed me a jagged wound, which had evidently been caused by the passage of a bullet which, had it gone a little deeper, must have inflicted serious injury. As it was, the wound was but trifling. He had evidently been attempting to dress it himself, but finding some considerable inflammation, he very likely got a little alarmed. You dressed the wound? I did. And what do you think of Sir Francis Varney, now that you have had so capital an opportunity, said Henry, of a close examination of him? Why, there certainly is something odd about him, which I cannot very well define, but take him altogether, he can be a very gentlemanly man indeed. So he can. His manners are easy and polished. He is evidently mixed in good society, and I never in all my life heard such a sweet, soft, winning voice. That is strictly him. You noticed, I presume, his great likeness to the portrait on the panel? I did, at some moments, and viewing his face in some particular lights, it showed much more strongly than others. My impression was that he could, when he liked, look much more like the portrait on the panel than when he allowed his face to assume its ordinary appearance. Probably such an impression would be produced upon your mind, said Charles, by some accidental expression of the countenance which even he was not aware of, and which often occurs in families. That may be so. Of course, you did not hint, sir, at what is passed here with regard to him, said Henry. I did not, being, you see, called in professionally. I had no right to take advantage of that circumstance to make any remarks to him about his private affairs. Certainly not. It was all one to me whether he was a vampire or not, professionally, and however deeply I might feel personally interested in the matter, I said nothing to him about it, because, you see, if I had, he would have had a fair opportunity of saying at once, Pray, sir, what is that to you? And I should have been at a loss what to reply. can we doubt, said Henry, but that this very wound has been inflicted upon Sir Francis Varney by the pistol bullet which was discharged at him by Flora? Everything leads to such an assumption, certainly, said Charles Holland. And yet you cannot even deduce from that the absolute fact of Sir Francis Varney being a vampire? I do not think, Mr. Chillingworth, said Marchdale, anything would convince you but a visit from him, and an actual attempt to fasten upon some of your own veins. That would not convince me, said Chillingworth. Then you will not be convinced? I certainly will not. I mean to hold out to the last. I said at the first, and I say so still, that I never will give way to this most outrageous superstition. I wish I could think with you, said Marchdale, with a shudder, but there may be something in the very atmosphere of this house which has been rendered hideous by the awful visits that have been made to it, which forbids me to disbelieve in those things which others more happily situated can hold at arm's length and utterly repudiate. There may be, said Henry, but as to that, I think, after the very strongly expressed wish of Flora, I will decide upon leaving the house. Will you sell it or let it? The latter I should much prefer, was the reply. But who will take it now, except Sir Francis Varney? Why not at once let him have it? I am well aware that this does sound odd advice, but remember, we are all the creatures of circumstances, and that in some cases where we least like it, we must swim with the stream. That you will not decide upon, however, at present, said Charles Holland, as he rose. Certainly not. A few days can make no difference. None for the worse, certainly, and possibly much for the better. Be it so. We will wait. Uncle, said Charles, will you spare me half an hour of your company? An hour, my boy, if you want it, said the Admiral, rising from his chair. Then this consultation is over, said Henry, and we quite understand that to leave the hall is a matter determined on, and that in a few days a decision shall be come to as to whether Varney the vampire shall be its tenant or not. A tale of stark terror is The House of Fear, written by Albert Seymour Graham. A house of silence, broken at times by a weird wailing, as from the pit. A house of dreams, gray in the moonlight, under the leprous silvered finger of the moon, brooding now a grim gray fortress of the accursed, the stronghold of the beast. Dense pines grew about it, and when the wind wailed among them, it met and mingled with an eerie ululation, rising as if muffled by many thicknesses of walls, to end with a quick shriek and a sudden hush, broken after a moment by the faint echo of a taunting laugh. That laugh would have struck terror to the swart soul of a Lucifer, if Lucifers have souls, for it was like an eldritch howling, faint and thin, like the thin, tinkling laughter of a fiend, without pity and without ruth. Here, in the sanitarium of Dr. Helmholtz, there were secrets within secrets, walls within walls, downward as in Dante's seventh Hades, and from this monastery of the hopeless there penetrated, on occasion, outward from its battlemented walls, wild, frantic laughter. But there was nothing demonic about it, because it was the laughter of the insane. But that other laughter, like a sound heard in dreams, passers-by, if there were any such, hearing it, would shudder and pass on. For the secret of that house of doom was terrible and grim, a secret for him who might have guessed at it, to be whispered behind closed doors and with bated breath. And there had been those who had whispered of the souls within those walls, and the whisper ran that they were indeed madmen, who had not always been mad, but had become maniacs after their commitment to the bleak house within the wood. In a bare cell, 6 feet by 6, a cubicle in which there was barely sufficient headroom for a tall man to stand upright, a figure stood with its hand clenched upon the bars, staring outward at the grim wood visible to the south. Harold Barron, banker, had abode here in this living tomb 3 weeks, say rather 3 centuries, in which, as in a nightmare of cold horror, he had been aware merely of a face, 3-pointed, bearded, the eyes active with a malign intelligence, the lips smiling always with the cold smile of death. Twice a day the small panel in his cell door had slid backward without sound, to frame in the opening the face of Dr. Helmholtz, like a face without a body and without a soul. Carol Barron, banker, knew that it was not a dream that would pass, because on the second day the head had spoken. Barron was scarcely a coward. He had fought like a baited grizzly when surprised in his house by the men who had brought him under cover of the night to this prison house. Now, at the voice, like the slow drip of an acid, Barron stared straight before him with the gaze of a man who had abandoned hope. "My dear Mr. Barron," the voice had whispered, "the little matter of that check, if you please. You will make it out to cash." "Ah, that is good. I perceive you are." It had not been the pistol in the lean, claw-like hand, nor even the eyes, brooding upon him with the impersonal cold stare of a cobra. Carol Barron might have refused if it had not been for the sounds that he had heard and the sights that he had seen when taken at midnight from his cubicle. He had beheld the administration of the cone. And, like Macbeth, with that one sight, and the sight of that which came after, he had supped full of horrors until now, at the bidding of that toneless voice, he had obeyed. 3 times thereafter, at the command of his dark jailer, he had paid tribute, nor had he been of all that lost battalion the single victim, for there had been now, separated from him scarce a dozen feet, a girl with golden hair sat huddled, eyes in a sightless staring upon the stone floor of her cell. Like Barron, she had not been mercifully killed. She had been saved for a fate unspeakable, beside which death would be a little thing. So far she had been treated decently enough. Her cell was wide and airy, plainly but comfortably furnished. But as to the look in the gray-green eyes of the master of black magic, she was not so sure. There came a sudden movement in the corridor without, a panting, a snuffling, and the quick pad of marching feet. The girl, her eye to the keyhole of the door, could see but dimly. She made out merely the sheeted figures, the grim gliding ghosts, and a rigid figure on the stretcher, moving silently on its rubber-tired wheels. Then, at an odor stealing inward through the keyhole, she recoiled. That perfume had been sickish sweet, overpowering, dense, and yet sharp, with a faint, acrid sweetness, the odor of ether. And then, although she could not see it, a man in the next cell had risen, white-faced, from his cot, to sink back limply as the dark hand holding that inverted cone had swept downward to his face. Carol Barron sprang to his feet as the narrow door swung open, to press backward against the window bars as the high priest of horror followed with his familiars, cowled and hooded. They entered. The doctor spoke, and his voice was like a chill wind. "My friend, I bring you forgetfulness. A brief lethe of hours. And then you will be a new man, a man reborn, my friend. Now," Barron, his face gray with a sort of hideous strain, stared silent, white-lipped, as, at a low-voiced order, the attendants came forward. The lean hand reached forward. It poised, darted, swooped, and in it was the cone. A choked gurgle, a strangled sharp cry, penetrating outward in a vague shadow of clamor, and then silence, with the faint whisper of the wind among the pines, the brool of the rushing river, the faint, half-audible footfalls passing and repassing in that corridor of the dead. Once, and it was never repeated, a man came there from the capital. He had demanded to see the doctor's patients, and as the investigator stood there viewing with a faint, creeping horror the nondescripts paraded before him, gibbering, mouthing, in an inarticulate, furious babble, a man had burst suddenly from the line with a strangled cry. "Frank! Don't you know me? I'm Baron Carroll." The voice was the voice of Baron, but the face, it was the face of another, totally unlike. There had been no possible resemblance, but the man had been sane. The investigator was persuaded of that he was suffering under a peculiar delusion, indeed, but the man rushed forward then, bearing his arm, and there, on that thin, pitiful flesh which had once been healthy and hard, there ran a curious design in red. The investigator sucked in his breath as that telltale birthmark sprang livid under his gaze, for he had seen it before. The doctor's eyes narrowed to slits. Somehow the man from the capital gained the impression that it was the first time he had seen that mark. But the investigator could do nothing. Birthmarks can be duplicated. He waited then in a curious indecision as the bearded doctor interposed suavely. "Well, of course, Commissioner, you're quite aware, or you should be, how it is. These paranoiacs are noted for their delusions. They believe themselves to be someone else, and always a bank president, say, a famous actor, an author, a great general. Now, Mr. Baron, you knew him, I believe?" Beneath that silken tone there ran suddenly a hint of iron, of menace, veiled but actual. The investigator felt it. "This patient knew your name, of course," the suave voice continued. "Poor fellow, we must be gentle with him." And there the matter ended. Curiously enough, the man who had claimed to be Banker Baron had, after that first burst of frenzied speech, kept silent. Perhaps that mordant gleaming in the doctor's eyes had telegraphed a warning, a message, a command. Nevertheless, the investigator, still dissatisfied, took another walk through the corridors and determined to find the thing that seemed to be wrong. Corridor after corridor he traversed, and found nothing amiss. But while going through a last corridor, he saw a woman standing before a mirror, gazing into the face that appeared to her, and laughing, but there was no mirth in that laugh. Then the investigator returned. As he looked at his own features in a glass, with the memory of that hideous laugh still ringing in his ears, he fancied suddenly beholding another's face where his own should be, and wondered whether that shock would not deprive him of his reason. For the woman he had seen, staring at her reflection in the glass, had had golden hair, pretty hands, and an adorable figure, but her face had been the rough, unshaven face of a man. But nothing could be done. The woman might have been born with the features of a man, but the investigator doubted it. Nevertheless, personal opinions have no influence over law, and law sometimes upholds crimes that have never been brought to account. The investigator went home, oddly shaken, to dream of a white face with staring eyes which changed, even as he gazed into the face of his long-lost friend, Carroll Baron, to hear, even in his dream, a voice, and it was the voice of the living and of the dead. The House of Fear, written by Albert Seymour Graham. Varney the Vampire, Chapter 22, written by Thomas Peckett Prest and James Malcolm Rymer. Edward E. French speaking. Copyright exists on all recordings issued by Edward E. French. Any unauthorized broadcasting, public performance, copying, or re-recording of these audiobooks in any manner whatsoever will constitute an infringement of such copyright. Editing, alteration, copying, or redistribution inconsistent with copyright laws is prohibited, whether by digital, electronic, or other means. Links may be used, provided that full and clear credit is given to Edward E. French with appropriate and specific direction to the original content. Direct inquiries regarding this recording to Edward E. French at email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. Subscribe to the Fiction Fantastique channel, www.youtube.com/FrenchEdward06.